Now we often have to relate measurements that are written with different prefixes. For example, if I look at the barrel of a micropipetter and I read the volume that the micropipetter is delivering, it may be 732 microliters. And I may need to express that in milliliters instead. How do I do that? How do I change the prefix that I'm using? Alright, well, you can think of it like a two-step process if you like. You don't know how to relate microliters and milliliters directly necessarily, but if you know that SI prefix table that I asked you to memorize, you will know that 1 microliter is the same thing as 10 to the minus 6 liters. And you will know that 1 milliliter is the same thing as 10 to the minus 3 liters. So what these two units have in common is liters. You can take the first prefix off and then put the second one on. So let's try that. If you have 732 microliters, that's the same thing as 732 times 10 to the minus 6 liters. Now, let's put this in proper scientific notation. If I make this 100 times smaller, I have to make this 100 times bigger. So I bump the decimal place over 2 places to make it 100 times smaller. To make this 100 times bigger, this is going to be times 10 to the 2. Minus 6 plus 2 is minus 4. So there I've converted it into liters. Now I could convert it into milliliters. How? Well, let's change the prefix so that it's 10 to the minus 3 there. Now I made it bigger by a factor of 10, so I have to make this one smaller by a factor of 10. And then I could just write 0.732 milliliters. All right, that worked, but it's kind of complicated, right? There was a lot of shifting and decimal point shifting I had to do. There's an easier way to do it if I think about it. How about this? First thing I do is write down what I want. Let's call that the target. That's the unknown. That's the thing I'm trying to find. I'm trying to find milliliters. The second thing I do is write down what I'm starting with. 732 microliters. So what I'm trying to do here is connect 732 microliters with my target, which is in milliliters. I'm going to write a roadmap down. So let's clean this up a little bit. Now, picking out your target as your first step is really going to be a smart thing to do in more complicated problems than this. This one's not so bad. It's pretty clear where we want to go. And it's also pretty clear where we start because we only have one number. But we're going to run across problems where it's not always that clear where you want to go, and not always clear which of the many numbers that they give you is a good starting point. So this is kind of an ultra simple example. So the third thing I want to do is connect those two things. I'm going to write a roadmap, what I'm going to call a roadmap. It's going to start with 732 microliters, and I'm going to connect it somehow to milliliters. And the connection that I know is through liters, because I know how many microliters are in a liter, and I know how many milliliters are in a liter, or I can at least relate liters and microliters. So I'm going to put that in the center of my roadmap. That is the connection between microliters and milliliters. I could connect through liters first. And we did the calculation the long way just a little while ago. Now, I can write down those little facts. 1 microliter is 10 to the minus 6 liters. And that's a fact that connects microliters and liters in my roadmap. Now I need a connection between liters and milliliters. And I know that 1 milliliter is 10 to the minus 3 liters. So that's a fact that connects those and those. Now I have a roadmap for the problem. The problem's all hooked together. I can see how I take this information, and it makes a set of stepping stones from the start to the target. Now I can turn this roadmap into a calculation like this. I'm going to imagine that I'm going to take my starting point and multiply it by a bunch of fractions that are equal to 1. Now if I divide both sides of this by microliters, by 1 microliter, I'll have 1 equals 10 to the minus 6 liters over 1 microliter, right? And that's equal to 1 if I divide both sides of this equation by 1 microliter. So I can multiply what I started out with by 1, and it's still the same number. Except that what's going to happen is something interesting. The units are going to change. The microliters on top and the microliters on bottom will cancel out, and I am going to be left with liters as my units. So this is how I can turn microliters into liters. I can look at it like this. I'm calling this fraction that I built out of the link a conversion factor. Now I can do this second jump on my roadmap as another conversion factor. Now what should go on top and what should go on the bottom? Well, I've got liters on top here, and I'd like to get rid of liters and get milliliters. So I'd like it to be set up like this, with liters on the bottom so that the liters will cancel. And then milliliters has to go on the other side. Now I see a 10 to the minus 3 sitting next to the liters there. And I see a 1 sitting next to the milliliter there. And now the liters will cancel, and the only unit that didn't cancel out is my milliliters. So I would have my answer. Now, I could do this in my head. 10 to the minus 6 divided by 10 to the minus 3 is 10 to the minus 6 minus a minus 3. 10 to the minus 6 plus 3, which is 10 to the minus 3. So it would be 732 times 10 to the minus 3 milliliters. Or, if I want to make proper scientific notation, I can shift the decimal point so it is just to the right of the first non-zero digit. That would be 7.32. And I have to shift the decimal point, I have to shift the size of this by 100 places too. So this would be what? If I made this 100 times smaller, I have to make that 100 times bigger. Or I could write that as... So what I have here is really a 4-step procedure for converting units. And this applies not only to the SI prefixes, but to any set of units. So I pick out my target, milliliters in this case. I pick out what I'm starting from. 732 microliters is what I'm trying to turn into milliliters. Then I connect the start with the target with relationships until I have a continuous set of stepping stones from the start to the target. Then I take, fourth step is I take my roadmap and I turn it into a calculation. I am going to turn each of the little links into a fraction called a conversion factor. And I'm going to set up the conversion factor so that the units cancel out. The units I don't want are going to cancel to give me the units that I do want, the units of my target. And I will get a result of that.